now let's talk about IVF, in vitro fertilization. When an egg and a sperm come together, and within 5 days, there's a blastocyst. Okay, it's just a bunch of cells at that point. There's no heartbeat, there's no spinal cord, there's nothing. It's a blastocyst. That's the point where they're either frozen or transferred to the woman's uterus, hoping that it will implant and develop. Okay, but
or discarded. Those are the options.
Well, wait a minute. I didn't get to that yet.
I'm sorry.
When an embryo in a petri dish is not viable because it's in a petri dish. It cannot grow into a human being because it's in a petri dish. Now, we have in this country hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos that are just being frozen, most of which in perpetuity. The estimate is like 500,000. I think this could be twice that. Okay. Why? Why are there so many frozen embryos? Why are there these extra embryos? This is everyone's worried about. When a woman has a hard time conceiving, or if there's donor involved or whatever, they are given medications to stimulate their ovaries to create more than one mature egg in a cycle. That's because they've been trying and that one mature egg hasn't been working. So what they do is they stimulate to create more mature eggs than she normally would in one cycle, usually between 10 and 20. Okay. And when those follicles, when those eggs are kind of mature, they are aspirated through a ovarian cyst aspiration. And then they are put in a petri dish, mixed with the sperm and observed. And some will just die out. And some will fertilize healthfully and grow into robust embryos. And some will be kind of not so good embryos. And they rate them on a good, better, best. The embryologists do this. And then if there's a fresh transfer, one of those really, really good quality embryos would be transferred, or they'll all be frozen for later use. Sometimes first they'll be genetically tested and then sorted out that way. And then eventually, one by one, they will be thawed and transferred. So let's say, typical scenario, a woman gets 15 eggs and 12 are mature and 8 fertilize, and you get 3 really good blastocysts. Okay. One is eventually transferred and it works. She has a baby. The other 2 are there frozen. She can thaw and have a sibling later, or maybe not. And then they're just frozen. Okay. So that's why IVF produces all these embryos. Okay. If it is a very expensive process, maybe because let's say generally like $30,000 every time to do this, insurance may not cover it or whatever. So it is most efficient to try to stimulate, get a good number of eggs and get a good number of embryos, because chances are most of those embryos will not end up working. So that's why we have so many. So theoretically, these embryos in the petri dish are not viable children. So, and again, the Dobbs decision doesn't speak to this at all, correct? So why do you think some people are worried?
What it does is it gives more ammunition and support to the personhood movement, to the people who are out there thinking that life begins at conception, at the time, and conception in the assisted reproduction world is when the embryo itself is created. So if each frozen embryo is considered to be a life, for those people that consider that to be the case.
And just to say, it's a pretty small percentage of people, like most anti-abortion activists say, we're not interested in IVF, that's not on our agenda. But there is a small and also powerful contingent that believes this.
Well, from what I understand, the ASRM and other legal scholars that have written about this do not believe that it's going to go quite as far as impacting the embryos that are out there or what can be done specifically with embryos. So while it's a real practical concern when somebody is pregnant on their own through a surrogate mother, whether I've seen hypothetical arguments now, even when it comes to embryos that are thawed for transfer. If an embryo that is thawed doesn't survive, would that be considered, a termination, or should that, is that possible? So people aren't able to answer those questions as definitively as they used to be. But I think what we're dealing with now is a further and more significant erosion of people's autonomy and rights over their body. But I don't think it goes so far as to affect what can be done when it comes to not even surrogate moms, but just regular IVF transfers of embryos to recipient mothers using donors or using their own genetic
So, for
material.
example, an embryo, can it be sent out for genetic testing and then destroyed if there's a genetic abnormality? Is that an abortion?
Right now it isn't. But what is happening, and this is this. Let's separate what people are fearful about from what's really happening as far as protective measures. What is occurring is that IVF centers that store embryos in their cryopreservation facilities that are located in states that have these trigger laws or that have very restrictive statutes that are now being enforced are moving the embryos out of those states to states that have cryopreservation facilities that are not impacted by this decision. And there's some larger IVF clinics that have practices in a number of states, and they're consolidating their embryos into states where they're not going to be as concerned that there could be some state law changes that will perhaps ultimately affect what can be done with the embryo. So people are sort of closing ranks, moving things, trying to shift and prepare for what may come down the road, because there's the thought that this is the beginning of even more erosion of what people can do. And maybe it will extend itself to the assisted reproductive world. Right now, it hasn't. We just don't know what the future holds. But it is so hard and expensive and lengthy to put together a surrogate parenting arrangement that I wouldn't want people to overreact and think that this means it's impossible or it's fraught with risk that wasn't there before. It's a hurdle, but it's not a risk that is very likely to have a significant effect on the process itself.
At this point, right.
Careful planning.
There was an article in the Times today that had 3 possible solutions, none of them really great. One was to restrict the number of embryos you could make, which is just not practical and really reduces your chance of success. Another one is having separate laws that protect IVF separate from this abortion law, which one person thought could be discriminatory because only fancy rich people can do IVF. I don't buy that.
I think that's an interesting argument. That's Professor Dar's argument that I think it's just a hypothetical thought, because we're not going to actually have specific laws related to termination in the IVF world. In fact, it looks like it's not happening that way at all, in the sense that incest and rape and all these other things are lumped together, including the life of the mother, with what is still not allowed. So those carve-outs weren't made. I can't imagine a carve-out for IVF would be made. But what she's saying is that since generally people with means are those who pursue IVF, generally Caucasian people are pursuing IVF, and generally people of color overwhelmingly are the ones who are suffering through these restrictive abortion statutes in states where they can't necessarily leave, then we will see more women having terminations that are people of color, and more women who are protected by some potential statute being white women. And that's what she was positing as a hypothetical, which I'm not so sure ever happened.
I don't buy that. The other thing.
There's one other talk about that other thing that you mentioned that is so crazy. The
other thing, which I think is so ridiculous, it's just like this ridiculous pantomime to like placate Alito and Thomas. I don't see what the point is to thaw. If you have extra embryos, but you don't plan on using them, don't need to use them, thaw them, transfer them into a uterus that isn't prepared for pregnancy or just not ready for pregnancy, whatever. Just let them die a natural death, which to me is just it's just a play acting, theater.
Force the woman to be a vehicle in the discarding of the embryo.
Yeah,
rather
it's like,
than
well, we're not really killing it; it's just dying a natural death. But you know what? A miscarriage. It's just basically a miscarriage. In some places, they're going to criminalize miscarriage. I think it's just if they believe that thawing an embryo and letting it die is murder. This is just another version of murder to them. It's not, I don't think any of these
The field or impractical possibility that was floated is this idea of maybe creating fewer embryos, which to some people are considered life, but freezing separately eggs and sperm, and then just like creating one embryo at a time as
again, that's not practical because you're severely reducing the chances of success that way. Because frozen eggs are way more fragile than frozen embryos. And it's just, I think a lot of people who are worried about IVF, who really think that there's personhood in a frozen embryo, I don't know if they really understand the biology and the practicality of IVF. I just think everything is a theoretical entity. Like the frozen, the fertilized egg and sperm together are to them like this theoretical entity disassociated from a woman. And in reading the Dobbs decision, they're talking about this fetus as if it were existed somewhere outside a woman's body. Like the word woman really only appeared when they were quoting the other side to refute it. Like the word woman hardly ever appears in this decision. It almost seems like this all happens somewhere else.
Well,
And also just one more thing I'm going to mention, I'm going to put in the notes to this video, the ASRM put out a position statement on this, and they're not too worried about the immediate effects on IVF on this for this decision, which
I don't think it's going to have a chilling effect on IVF at all, because people who want babies are not going to have their wishes diminished by this decision. What I think will happen is there'll be a change in the landscape of IVF, similar in a way to what's happening if you've seen some of these articles about how all the states surrounding Illinois are states that have restrictive abortion statutes or will have them. And people are now flooding in or coming in larger numbers to Illinois to be able to have terminations. I think what may happen is IVF clinics that may be in some of those states like Iowa and other, people won't want to work there. They won't want to store embryos there. They'll end up going to Chicago instead to do their IVF, especially people that have resources. So in New York and California and New England states where we are progressive and have responsible viewpoints, I don't think anything's going to change, but I do think there are going to be people, because there are people in Alabama that have money and want a baby. Not a lot, but there's got to be some. They're just not going to stay in Alabama. They're going to go to other states in order to do everything. So we think the same way when it comes to surrogacy. We work in states. There are many factors to consider. The termination posture of a state is just one of them. And again, it's not something that needs to have tons of thought because it's not a very foreseeable outcome. What's much more concerning to me is quality obstetric care, excellent hospitals, educated women, qualified carriers. Those are much higher on the list of qualifications and concerns when we determine who's going to be in our program and how we match people than whether or not they're in a state that will allow for termination. The clauses in the contract all indicate that you agree to go to a location where it is still safe and legal to terminate. And we still work with women who are not strict anti-abortionists that understand that this potentially could happen, although it's very unlikely. So we still look at it the same way. We just take more care when it comes to the navigation of the possibility and the understanding that's written into the contract. It's still a meeting of the minds. It's nothing that nobody can be hauled from there's Ohio into Illinois for a termination unless she agrees to, and she has to do it voluntarily.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. I think this really helps the general public understand the implications of this decision, which can be confusing to a lot of people. So thanks so much, Sanford, for your expertise.
Well, I've always enjoyed talking with you, Kathy. Thank you.